Welcome everyone to Wild Farm Alliance's The Role of Birds on the Farm online course. I enjoy this topic immensely and hope you will too. Birds are so fascinating, beautiful, and their songs gladden our hearts. Many offer pest control services to farms, and some we need to coexist with, supporting them when they're beneficial and managing them when they're not. Thank you for continuing to take this poll as you jump on. I am Joanne Baumgartner with the Wild Farm Alliance. This course is part of the Farmland Flyways project, where we'd like to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms in the US. So please consider, let's see, here we go. Here's our title slide, and you can see the Farmland Flyways logo on the bottom right. And today we're going to talk about how beneficial birds have saved farmers money for a long time. But I want you to please consider sticking around for all 10 of our lessons in this course. We have 16 different speakers, 2 sessions each month from now through July. And while you don't have to attend all of them, we hope you will. So some of the other lessons are how many and what kinds of pests birds eat. Then how do you support insect-eating birds with nest boxes and buildings? How to support rodent-eating birds, managing pest birds with birds like this American kestrel, managing and coexisting with birds like this quail, making the most of birds' diet and foraging strategies, farmscape and landscape features, seeing the land through the eyes of birds, and finally prioritizing what birds prefer. So in today's lesson, let's see, I want to move out of this. In today's lesson, we are, I'm speaking and Sara Kross, and we'll be taking questions after each of our talks and then running some quick polls to allow you to think about these topics. Then we'll have some time towards the end for you to share your experiences and stories. So with that, I am going to start my slideshow. Which I guess I'm in. I just need to go here. And Shelley, I think, is it time to end the poll, or should we keep it? Are we there yet? Keep it going.
Maybe we can give everyone just like 30 more seconds to fill out the poll. It should be the pre-survey on your screen. We'll just take 30 more seconds or so to let you answer.
Yep, that sounds good. Well, yeah, as I said, I'm Joanne Baumgartner, Executive Director, and this is our first lesson. I wanted to start out with this really cool poem from Longfellow that he wrote in the 1870s. You could call them thieves and pillagers, but no, they are the winged wardens of your farms, who from the cornfields drive the insidious foe, and from your harvest keep 100 harms. Even the blackest of them all, the crow, renders good service as your man at arms, crushing the beetle in his coat of mail and crying havoc on the slug and snail. So people have recognized for quite a while that birds are important on the farm. And, you know, agriculture has this huge footprint in the continental US, almost 60% of the landscape. And so there's quite an ability to support farms or support birds on farms because of that and in our world. So there is the result of the pre-survey. Thank you so much for taking that. This is Sara Kross's slide.
Hey, Jill,
And yes.
Joanna, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure that you're showing the right, you're not showing your screen, the right presentation.
I'm not?
No, I still see the prioritizing what birds prefer. Oh.
Okay, let's see. I will try again. Now, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Good. Well, I was just showing you that 60% of the continental US is in agriculture. And this is Sara's slide, which shows how avian pest control has been occurring around the world, or the study of avian pest control, and everything from corn and apples and broccoli and almonds and coffee and chocolate. And in fact, so much has been done, and that we put together all of those studies, or as many as we could find, over 120, and put them in this booklet, Supporting Beneficial Birds and Managing Pest Birds, which you can download from our website at wildfarmalliance.org. And I think you were told about it in an email you got this morning, reminded you about this session, that there's a resource page where there's lots of materials, including this. And I'm showing you the appendix because the appendix actually describes those 120 studies in a really easy way to look at them. And these studies are in vegetables, fruit, nuts, grasslands, pastures for birds eating insects. But then there's also studies looking at raptors consuming rodents and pest birds. And all these studies showed, of all these studies, 90% showed that yes, birds are beneficial. 30% of them, the researchers were looking at how is that helping the crop? Is it benefiting the growth or the yield? 30% of them looked at, was habitat important? 20% of them looked at whether it was important to put up nest boxes. And 5% of them showed that yes, the birds were important, but they are also, while they are beneficial some of the time for the crop, they were also a pest. And then 3% of the studies showed that birds killed beneficial insects and were enough to constrain pest control. So things are messy. Nature is a little messy, but it's fascinating to look at all those studies and realize that yeah, birds are helping with pest control all over, and all kinds of crops all over the world. And these studies, so in the beginning, and you're going to see in a few minutes some slides about years ago, people began studying avian pest control, and they would just look at stomach analysis back when you could kill birds and do that, and they'd use observations. But more recently, they're excluding birds from part of the crop and not excluding from others, and see the benefits there. Sometimes it's more than just finding out that they are eating the pest, but actually, well, how does that help with, growing the crop? Researchers also are doing modeling predictions. And what's really cool is there's DNA analysis now where they can find out what the birds are eating and if they're carrying pathogens. And then how does the farmscape and the landscape actually influence their presence and the pest control. And so I studied birds eating codling moth in apple orchards, and this is a chestnut back chickadee in an apple orchard using a natural cavity in the tree. And their studies have been conducted in different parts of the world looking at birds eating codling moth, and the results range from only 13% to almost 100% of overwintering codling moth being killed by birds. And in this study, which is over in Europe, this bird is a blue tit, which is closely related to the chickadee. Researchers are putting up boxes and seeing that it is beneficial to put them up. And one study showed that we had apple yields increase 66% when you brought the birds in. Another study, this is in almonds in Australia, where you can see they excluded birds for part of the crop, and the birds like to eat almonds. Some birds do, like ravens and parrots. And so over here on the left, this is showing how birds, both blue is edge and red is interior, where they were eating the nuts before harvest. And then this was non-bird damage. But then afterwards, they come in and they clean up the mommy nuts, they're called, the nuts that are left there in the crop that need to be harvested, because otherwise there'll be diseases and pests being carried into the next year. And what they found was there was a positive net return when you subtract out the bird damage from what it costs to actually go in there and either mechanically or manually pick up those nuts. The birds were providing a service, and they found between $25 and $275 per Australian dollars per hectare. Where the birds were a benefit. Here in the States, in California, a study looked at, they weren't looking at how much money you save, but they were looking at how birds and or rodents were consuming these mummy nuts. And it really increased when there was a diversified plant understory. We're here, the top left chart. And it also increased as the orchards were closer to natural habitat. So diversity is important if you in that system for bringing in birds, and often that is the case. In this study, they showed about 90 to 70 to 90% increased yields when growers are putting in this simple T-post. And so what happens is this is a short crop, and so you just need a short T-post, as opposed to some bigger crops, you'd need a higher perch. And sometimes you can plant live perches like the sunflower row, where in Florida they showed how there was increase in or reduction of crop pests. And sometimes there's just anecdotal information. This is Peter Martinelli. He was having terrible problems with sparrows eating his broccoli, and he took off the sprinkler heads of the sprinkler heads on this line of irrigation pipe, and made little PVC tees and screwed them on, because he had seen this Cooper's hawk in his farm and thought, well, maybe if I put these perches really close to where the sparrows are causing problems, that they would help. And he had a great, as soon as he did that, the Cooper's hawk came right in and had a great broccoli harvest. But you can also put in tall raptor perches and put in owl boxes. And this study showed that there was a cost savings of about $7,500 per levy mile when folks put those in, and those levees were next to farm fields. The raptors were eating ground squirrels and gophers. This is one of Sara Kross's studies where, and photos where she's found that when you use perches, it's better to put them on the tops of hills as opposed to down in the valleys, because the birds are riding thermals. And also it's better to put the perches away from trees, because otherwise they're just going to use the trees. And 15-foot perches are better than 20-foot perches. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about economic ornithology. Back in 1885, the Division of Entomology created this economic ornithology as part of the USDA. And between the 1800s and 1800s on this side of this chart, and 1936, there was almost 1,500 studies published on economic ornithology. And remember, a lot of these were based on stomach analysis. There's some really beautiful artwork associated with these publications. And this one, farm help from the birds in 1920. This little piece right here is saying goals following the plow, picking up alfalfa weevils. But what's cool with this document is they're showing you what their lab setup was when they were analyzing stomach contents of birds. They actually analyzed 80,000 stomachs, asked farmers to shoot the birds and pickle their stomachs and mail them in, and they would then get or create or keep track of data. What were the birds eating? For example, red-tailed hawks, they looked at 562 studies and or stomachs, and there was 278 mice, 131 mammals, and then some 47 insects. They'd make these really cool charts where if you see this white line right through here, above that is animal food and below that is vegetable food. And so this was for the American crow. You can see that as spring comes around, they need to capture a lot of animal food, a lot of insects that they're feeding their young because they need high protein diets. But then it changes throughout the year. This is another study. And one of the things that happened at the same time that all this economic ornithology studies were going on is that there was a decline of birds occurring, both from so many women wearing hats with feathers. And sometimes, like you can see right here, there's a bird on the hat. And without really any regard to bird populations. And likewise, there was a lot of market hunting going on. And ornithologists were aware of that, and they had helped push through the Migratory Bird Species Act in the early 1900s. But by 1920, those market hunters and others were really pushing back. But in a hopeful note, people got together and really made a good case for why we need to protect birds. And Justice Holmes here from the Supreme Court, he said, "We see nothing in the Constitution that compels the government to sit by while a food supply is cut off and the protectors, meaning the birds, of our forests and our crops are destroyed. We are of the opinion that the treaty and statute must be upheld." So that was all I was going to cover today, and I am going to stop sharing. And let's see. So now I wanted to let's see. I wanted to run a little poll here and ask you all to think about what we just covered and kind of have a little active learning going on here. So we're going to run a quick poll and just wait 1 minute. It's a two questions. If you could answer them, and then I'll talk about them and we'll move on to Sarah's talk.
And I'll just point out we're collecting this information primarily so we can gauge how well our instruction is going. There's nothing tied to you personally, and it's not, you're not going to get a test result back or anything like that from this quiz, but it's for us to report back to our funders so that we can show that our messages are potentially getting through. So no pressure.
Thanks, Sarah. All right. Well, just to go over these questions, that you heard the story about the birds and almonds and another story about birds and apples. And while I would love to know whether birds could help with cannabis, and they probably do, they are not going to get into closed greenhouses. So that was kind of a trick question. And then that for perches, really, you want to put a perch that is higher than the crop. And so if the crop is low, then you could put a short perch in it. And likewise, if it's a tall, like an orchard, you need a tall perch. And that's it. I'm gonna hand it over to Sara now.
Hi, everybody. Okay, let me get my slides up now. I am Sara Kross. I'm currently a faculty member at Columbia University. I'm on the board of the Wild Farm Alliance, and I've been working with Joanne and Shelley and Brian and the whole team for quite a while now on many of these bird outputs. I am just going to kind of touch on a little bit more about what Joanne was talking about. We really thought about this first lesson as a general overview of a lot of the topics that you'll be learning more about in the upcoming 9 more detailed lessons. So this is kind of high level overview, but also a few examples from some of my own work. So as Joanne said, agricultural expansion and intensification are some of the biggest, they are the biggest challenges we have to biodiversity conservation right now globally, as well as in North America. So if you think about all of agricultural habitats as being kind of one ecosystem, which of course they aren't, but if you added them all up, it would be by far the largest ecosystem on the planet. And that, of course, is not good for actually all species, particularly terrestrial species. But we know very well that this is the greatest extinction threat to birds. And my personal view, and I think the view of the Wild Farm Alliance and many other people, and hopefully many of you, is that it aligns with Aldo Leopold's vision that conservation boils down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest, and really thinking about the ways that we can make those agricultural landscapes that we rely on for our food, fuels, and fibers into landscapes that can also support and benefit birds. We know that agriculture in North America is tied to many of the very large scale declines we're seeing in both common and rare species. This is a study that came out in 2019 that shows the relative change in the abundance of birds across North America from 1970, which I will remind everybody was not like a high point in our environmental history. Rivers were catching fire in the 1970s, and this was the decade in which all of or many of our environmental regulations related to clean air and clean water and endangered species was passed. But even compared to that relatively not high point in our environmental history, we've seen these really extreme declines in the abundance of birds across North America, which is very concerning for us as conservation biologists. So one of the big challenges that we face as conservationists, and I'm a conservation biologist as well as an agroecologist, but if we think about it from a conservation objective, one of the kind of big considerations is how can we improve farming landscapes to support more birds? And we can think about that at both the local scale. So what can you do along field margins like this one that's been planted in a hedgerow to potentially provide habitat for birds at the farm, as well as a landscape scale. So if you kind of zoom out and think about all of the neighboring properties and the non-farming areas around your property or the properties of farmers in general, how can all of these kind of local scale habitats add up to provide landscape scale changes for birds? And one big answer for that is habitat, of course. And that includes habitat restoration as well as protecting existing habitat. So this is a study that I was part of a big collaborative team to understand how what we called woody field margins, which I'll explain in a minute, change avian diversity and abundance. And we did this over 103 different fields in California's Central Valley. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with what California looks like. The valley runs down right down the center of it, as its name suggests. And if you took a bird's eye view, a very high bird's eye view of this landscape. It is a pretty diverse landscape in terms of the number and variety of crops that are grown, but it is wall-to-wall agriculture in most areas, with only these few remaining riparian corridors that kind of run through the valley. And in our studies, we compared what we called simple edges, which are these kind of bare or weedy edges in between fields that had no habitat that was managed kind of purposely for any reason on them. Often they were being disked or sprayed with herbicides by the growers we worked with. And we compared these simple habitats with what we called complex habitats, and those could include tree lines, for example, these valley oaks that were between fields, hedgerows, which were purposely planted by farmers to support pollinators and other wildlife between fields, and then these riparian corridors that were those natural remaining little strips in the landscape. And what we found, unsurprisingly, if you plant it, they will come. So comparing, and these are showing 2 different years of data, the 2 different gray bars, but this left-hand kind of couple are showing the species richness, so the total number of bird species we detected across all of our 103 fields. Although they weren't all bare or weedy, but across all of those fields, of the bare and weedy fields, which was approximately half of them, we found very low species richness, about 5 species on average. And then comparing that with the tree lines, the hedgerows, and the riparian corridors, we found more and more species richness as the richness of the habitat essentially increased. We also found that at the landscape scale, hedgerow and riparian margins that were further from woodland habitat harbored higher species richness. So even if you are working with farmers, or you are a farmer and you're not necessarily very close to a forest, or what we think of as sort of a source habitat for wildlife, those patches become islands of habitat out into the landscape. So if they're not so far that birds wouldn't be able to find it, if they were kind of flying toward the horizon, they will probably attract different species. So that sounds great for conservation. And there have been a number of studies that have shown that these habitat level restoration projects can really have a big difference for conservation and for birds. But the reality of this is that farmers have to be able to work their land and to be able to produce from their land. And so we have worked kind of as science, and then as the Wild Farm Alliance, we've worked a lot at understanding the feedbacks of what happens if you can diversify your farm and provide habitat for birds and attract different species. What does that mean for ecosystem services? So the benefits that you would gain from birds, and that's along the economic ornithology lines that Joanne was just talking about. And then also, what are the disservices from those birds? And so some of the upcoming lessons in this series will discuss both of these concepts. So what are birds doing that's helpful for farmers? What are the potential downsides of birds? And how can you manage for both of these scenarios so that farmers can maximize the good and minimize the bad? Joanne just gave that example of the seagulls following the plows from the 1800s to pick up alfalfa weevils. And I actually did a study recently in California where we were looking at alfalfa weevils as well. But we used what is a modern method, which isn't like super high tech, but we weren't looking at the stomachs of birds. We were actually excluding them from areas of the crop. And this is my colleague and collaborator, Rod Kelsey, holding up one of our exclosures. And what these do is they keep birds out of an area of the crop. And so we went through and we hand harvested our alfalfa. We did this over 32 different fields. So we actually ended up hand harvesting with office scissors over a football field worth of alfalfa each year. And then we kind of shook that alfalfa up and we extracted, it's really hard to see here, but we were extracting these weevils from the alfalfa to see if there was a higher abundance in areas that birds couldn't access, which would show us that the birds were controlling that pest. We also looked at how habitat changed the bird diversity at those sites. And again, unsurprisingly, the higher the richness, the higher the complexity of the habitat along field margins was, the higher the bird species richness was. But looking at the alfalfa weevils, which is, you can see these little tiny green weevils in this alfalfa, and you can see the type of damage that they cause to this forage crop. So every bit that a weevil eats, a cow then can't eat. And what we found was that when there were birds excluded, so the no bird example, there were about 33% more alfalfa weevils than when birds could access the crop. So this holds true of that example where they looked in the stomachs of the birds to see that they were eating them. But here we found a really significant effect of the number of pests in this crop. So as Joanne pointed out, you can read all about this on the Wild Farm Alliance website, and you can also learn about a lot of these and other examples in the upcoming lessons. And that's that there. One of the most important things about this kind of system is that we need to know whether or not these changes will, or these effects of birds will change the way farmers manage their land. And it's been shown that farmer perceptions of environmental issues are a significant driver in beliefs and attitudes and their behaviors. So I know I'm talking to a mixed audience. Some of you are farmers, some of you work with farmers, some of you are kind of farm adjacent. But I just wanted to share a brief survey that I did with some colleagues, again in California, where we asked farmers what they thought about songbirds, bats, and birds of prey, how they thought they contributed to or took away from their farming operations, and then whether or not they actually spent money or their time to either actively attract birds by doing things like, or bats or raptors, by doing things like planting or maintaining habitat, putting up bird boxes or perches or bat boxes, or a number of other different practices they could use. And we also asked them whether or not they actively deterred any of those species by doing things like removing habitat or trying to scare them, or using other deterrent methods. And what we found, again, unsurprisingly, but kind of surprisingly, this hadn't been looked at before, is that farmers will take action. They will spend their money to attract or deter wildlife based on their perceptions of those wildlife. So this graph, just briefly, we kind of ranked farmers on across a range of questions about their perceptions of these different groups. This one is showing bats. This one is showing songbirds. This one is also showing songbirds, and this one is showing raptors. And what this is showing you is if farmers had generally, if they were spending money to attract bats, they actually, unsurprisingly, had a pretty positive view of bats. If they were spending money or time to attract birds, they had a positive view of birds. If they were spending money to deter birds, they had a negative view of birds. And we asked, the way we ranked that was asking about farmers' views of those different groups' effects on different components of their land management. And one of our coolest results, I think, is that farmers had these extremely positive views of birds of prey. So you don't have to be able to look at all of these bars here, but I highlighted this one because farmers found that raptors, birds of prey, were either somewhat beneficial or very beneficial over 95% of the time for vertebrate pest control. So I think I have time for this quick case study, which is from my PhD research in New Zealand, where I studied the effects of reintroducing the karearea, the New Zealand falcon, into the vineyards of Marlborough, which is the top largest wine growing region in New Zealand, and which has really significant bird damage problems. So the New Zealand falcon is this beautiful bird of prey. They are endemic to New Zealand. They're a bit smaller than our peregrine falcon here in North America. They're very, very fierce predators. They're kind of known among falconers internationally for being really tough. And in New Zealand, they're not doing very well. They're currently restricted only to the mountainous regions in New Zealand, and that's because they're a ground nesting bird. And there's a lot of interesting background on this species from a conservation perspective and an evolution perspective. But from the farming perspective, what I studied was this project called Falcons for Grapes, which was reintroducing falcons from those strongholds in the high country, in the mountains, and releasing them in vineyards, where, as the name suggests, the organization that was doing this, International Wildlife Consultants, assumed that falcons would be helping to prevent pest damage from birds in the vineyards of New Zealand. And New Zealand is this unique, beautiful place. The vineyards are lovely, the wine is delicious, but they have 3 different species of introduced bird that are all European species that were introduced to New Zealand. All of these birds take whole grapes off of bunches, just like you or I would. So their damage is very easy to see. I mean, this is all, you would rarely find all of the grapes removed from one bunch. This was a particularly neurotic song thrush, I think, that did this to this Gewürztraminer bunch. And then there's the tauhau, the silver eye, which is a self-introduced native. They're very small. They weigh about 13 grams. They're probably, they're very small birds. Sorry, lost my train of thought. And what we did is we compared vineyards that had falcons and vineyards that didn't, and we found that there was a significant reduction in the numbers of song thrushes, blackbirds, and a marginally significant effect on starlings in vineyards that had falcons. So there were fewer of all of these pest birds in those vineyards. Although silver eyes do not care, they get eaten by falcons all the time, but they did not mind if there was a falcon in the vineyard. And importantly for the growers, we found that there was, and these are model results, which is part of why they're very consistent, but we did consistently find a significant impact of falcon presence on grape damage. And we found that there were about 95% fewer grapes that were removed and about half as many grapes that were packed. So even though the silver eyes weren't actually scared away in terms of numbers, they were still eating a lot fewer grapes when there was a falcon present in a vineyard. You're in a much better situation than the growers in New Zealand if you are joining us from North America today. There is a large diversity of birds of prey here in North America. You can learn more about how you can utilize birds of prey as well as other methods for managing pest birds in lesson 5 in this series. And if you're interested specifically in birds of prey for vertebrate pest control and rodent pest control, that will be in lesson 4. So that is the end of my contribution today. Here's just my kind of take homes. Habitat restoration is critical. Farmers will take action if we have the evidence to show that there are benefits or detriment from wildlife. Raptors are great, and we still have a lot to learn. So if any of you are in a position to encourage more funding for these areas for research, there are lots of questions remaining. So with that, I will stop sharing. I think we have another poll, shall we? And then we're going to have some time just for questions. And actually, if there was a question in here, I can try to answer it. How are the barn owls doing in New Zealand? That is a great question. So barn owls are a new self-introduced native in New Zealand. I actually don't, there was one breeding pair in the northern part of the island for a very long time, and I actually don't know whether that population has expanded at all. But that is a great question. I'll have to look that up. Robert Albee, I wish this course included a field trip to New Zealand. I will be relocating to New Zealand actually in August or late August this year to join the faculty at a university there. So look me up if you are taking a field trip to New Zealand. Thank you. Olivia, about the falcons, she asked whether or not my research investigated whether or not they impacted native wildlife, I think. There actually weren't, from what we could detect, any negative impacts from the falcons. But, and the way that I looked at that was whether I was monitoring breeding pairs and I could quantify their diet. And we generally found that they had similar diets across the vineyards in the high country, but that it was almost entirely introduced birds in both habitats. And I have a few hypotheses for why that is, but it doesn't seem like there's a major downside to native wildlife from falcons being there. But if you're interested in using, and I think in the upcoming lessons, they'll talk about this. If you're interested in putting up barn owl boxes or doing other things to attract birds of prey in particular to your land, it is important for you to know, and you probably would know this, if you have any really rare rodents in particular, if you're putting up barn owl boxes, because they are generalist predators and they'll go for what's available. So if you are near a population of rare species, you might want to think twice about putting up structures to try to attract birds of prey. Oh, Neva asked about how you would find out. There's a tool actually, and I can look up the website for it, but there's a tool to look up the known critical habitat of endangered species that are listed on in the Endangered Species Act. Another great way would be for you to contact your local extension agent, because they could probably put you in touch with or look up for you whether or not there are wildlife populations you should be worried about nearby. Great question. Okay, are we done with that poll, Shelley? Cool. Did anyone have any questions for Joanne, actually? Because I think we kind of jumped straight into my talk.
Yeah, well, that's okay. I'm happy to answer any.
Do the falcons eat snakes? Here they would. There aren't any snakes in New Zealand, but here you certainly would have some of the birds of prey eating snakes. It depends on how common the snakes are in your area and which birds of prey you have.
Yeah, well, so now, oh, here's a question. Does the Department of Ag still have a program similar to economic ornithology program? I mean, sort of, not really, but there are, there's an opportunity, a job announcement I think I just heard about, where in Napa and Sonoma area of California, they're going to hire somebody that will address economic ornithology. For the most part, it's just extension, helping with insect pests, and sometimes, like Rachel Long, one of our partners, knows a lot about birds, and works for a UC cooperative extension, and or Roger, oh shoot, I forget. Baldwin, Sara works with, he's with cooperative extension too, isn't he?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, but he is a vertebrate pest control person. So really thinking about, rodents and pest birds, and I don't think avian ecology and avian pest control is his expertise, although he has done some studies with Sara.
If you email him a bird question, he'll probably send it to me. In the USDA, there is the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and that service does provide farmers with help with trying to provide or protect habitat for different species, and there are different state level programs that will kind of tie into that. There's also the what's called APHIS, which I just had to look up what the acronym stood for because I forgot, which is the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, and they often will be involved if you have pest bird problems or problems related to other wildlife on the property. So those are kind of the two sides of it, but there is no specific economic ornithology office anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, we wanted to open it up and hear from you a little bit. Like, what are some stories, or do you have some stories or experiences you'd like to share with us that either concerns about birds or stories of how birds have helped on the farm? And if you do have a story, we would ask you to raise your hand, and what you could do down here in the reactions, and we'll unmute you. Yes, here's one. Now, how do we unmute Juan Carlos? Here we go.
Juan, I just gave you permission to unmute yourself.
We have done it. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, this is also Robert Frew here. Juan Carlos and I started farming after we were volunteers for the National Wildlife Federation through their backyard habitat program. So that has been a really great way to introduce people to how to really protect birds and other native wildlife, and also how to provide those 4 different elements for them in your own yard, whether it's in the city or out at a farm. And for us, we did that for about 11 years. It was a great way to make connections with other like-minded people in the community and find inroads into organizations that supported those same ideas and goals about native species, about songbird preservation. And so starting a farm after doing that was it was an easy transition, thinking about what are all the species that you really want to have on the farm and which are the ones you don't want to have based upon the diversity of the crops that you're growing. So our farm is based upon permaculture, and so the diversity is huge. We don't have any monocultures here like my relatives did on all their farms, which were corn, bean, and wheat. And so the population of birds we have here, I think, is really good. Raptors, bats, and other songbirds, but we do have a significant problem, and that is with starlings, European starlings. So we took a page out of the Book of the Amish. We bought one of those martin houses from an Amish gentleman who made it, and it's really a wonder to look at and to dream about how we can get martins in there. But the reality is that it's not easily done. This is our 4th year, I believe, with the martin house. We've never gotten a single martin, and we are on a main bird corridor here in Bloomington, Indiana. So we're close to one of the largest wildlife habitats in the United States, Goose Pond. And but to attract those martins is very, very difficult when you have so much competition from starlings. Do you have any ideas, suggestions, how we can manage better the starling population, as well as the second one are I believe they're called house sparrows. Those we have too many of also because we have barns and they can access those barns where the chickens are, and the chickens have food. And we've not come up with an idea of how to prevent the sparrows from nesting inside the barn and from eating the chicken feed.
As someone with chickens, I know it's very difficult to keep other birds out of chicken feed. And house sparrows are really hard in general. For starlings, and this kind of will depend on your personal outlook, I think, but you can manage them if they are invading your martin house, especially now since you don't have any martins utilizing that house. You can oil their eggs, and that will prevent them from hatching, but they won't relay. And we found that that's successful in kestrel box programs. Often with songbird boxes, you want to make sure that the entry hole for the songbird box is as small as possible, but still allows the species you're interested in. So I think for house martins, you may be able to put a smaller entry hole over each of the holes in that box that would keep starlings out. But that's a common challenge. Those two species are both introduced birds. They're not protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. They're two of the very few in this country that aren't protected. And you definitely have to think about your kind of view of how you want to control them, but preventing them from getting into those cavities, because they're both cavity nesting species. And then if they are getting in, potentially thinking of how to control the populations with methods like oiling the eggs could be strategies you could use. But some of that might come in the managing pest birds session that is in a few weeks. But thank you for that story. That's super interesting.
Great story. Yeah, others have any stories they'd like to share or concerns?
Just one last question. I'm sorry, I don't want to usurp the time here from others, but the oil, it makes no difference what kind of vegetable oil, let's say that it is.
Yeah, I think it was food grade vegetable oil we used in the Kestrel study. We're actually trying to get it published right now. But I think we'll take your contact details and we'll be able to follow. I'll try to follow up with you on exactly what kind you could use.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Joanne, I saw questions about sources of funding for habitat restoration or other pro-bird activities. I know that you and Shelley and Brian have been working on some of those recently.
Right, yeah. There is, as Sarah mentioned, there's USDA NRCS that has their QUIP program that helps support farmers putting in or repairing habitat, putting in hedgerows, wildflowers, beetle banks, which any kind of habitat that you bring to the farm, there's a bird that will use that habitat. Their NRCS also supports growers putting in bird boxes, so songbird boxes and owl boxes. And then we have in the last 4 years here in California has a Climate Smart program where it's really focused on greenhouse gases, both storing carbon in on the farm and alleviating greenhouse gases from going into the atmosphere. But it turns out that a lot of, if you want to store carbon on the farm, you need to plant habitat. And so all of those, there's a lot of money coming into California agriculture where it's the grower, we've been helping growers apply for those funds and then helping them with installation through California Department of Food and Agriculture's Healthy Soils program. And it's been really cool to see how many growers are really excited about, they can finally afford to put in the habitat. They've been wanting to do it forever, but this is making it a reality. And so I'm sure there are some other kinds of programs, but those are the two main ones I'm thinking about right now. Yeah, and Wendell says U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services partners for wildlife program can also be a source of habitat development and restoration. Let's see. So other stories, we have a few minutes left. Well, I think it's so fascinating. Oh, here's one. Is the Conservation Reserve Program popular in California? I study quail in Mississippi, and money from that program helps farmers put in conservation buffers for quail. Well, our state NRCS director would like to see the conservation reserve program be bigger, and also the conservation stewardship program be bigger in California, but it doesn't, I think land prices are so expensive here that it's not as attractive as in some other areas. Wondering if you have any sister organizations in Canada. I'm sure there are some. Sarah, do you have any ideas on that?
No, but I do have ideas on the barn owl nesting box plans that were just posted. Those are, I'm familiar with the plans from the UK. You probably don't want to use them in North America because they usually include a perch right on the outside of the box, which is dangerous for barn owls here because great horned owls will use those to access the box. So don't use the British plans. And in the session that Matt Johnson and Brianna Martinico are going to run, I think they'll go over some of the good designs. There's a number of good designs out there, and some of the considerations you might want to take for barn owl boxes here in North America. So I don't mean to like those are great plans for the UK, but they're probably not the best plans for here.
Yeah, and I know talking with Matt as he's preparing for this session, he says that he's been looking over his old or his more recent data, hundreds of boxes they've been looking at, and they're thinking that the boxes aren't big enough, they're not tall enough, and so he's going to recommend that they boxes start to be built taller, because what happens is if a grower doesn't get around to, doesn't have time to clean out a box, a bunch of the poop and the pellets that the birds regurgitate fill up the bottom of the box, and pretty soon all the birds are kind of squished in their box, and ideally that box would get cleaned out, but the reality of it is they don't get cleaned out as much as they should, and so we need to make sure they have room.
And those upcoming lessons, Brian just pointed out, lesson 3 is for songbirds and 4 is for raptors. There are a few considerations. It's kind of low-hanging fruit for a lot of growers to put up these boxes, and we're encouraging you to through the Wild Farm Alliance, but there are a few kind of basic guidelines for steps you can take, particularly to avoid high rates of nest predation by predators, as well as kind of management issues related to heat or other exposure, things that could happen in different areas. So those are good lessons to go to, or there's the NRCS does generally have good guidelines for a lot of these things, as does the Wild Farm Alliance website.
Yes, and we are working on a fact sheet for songbird nesting structures right now, and a little video that will be releasing soon.
And regarding Canada, I don't think the Wild Farm Alliance necessarily recognizes borders. So if you are looking for help, or the birds certainly don't. So, you know, I think we're certain a lot of these will remain true from the Wild Farm Alliance perspective across all of our borders. So much of this guidance will be relevant in Canada, but the government level funding is probably a different setup.
Wendell Gilgert had something to say, so I just wanted to let him speak.
Yeah, thanks. Just going back to the question about CRP in California, you know, the technical eligibility for the program is highly erodible land. And so California doesn't, except for the foothills around the Great Valley and up in Siskiyou County, doesn't have that much highly erodible land that meets the qualifications. We don't have recognized wind erosion, so which is why the folks in Mississippi, you know, are able to take advantage of that program. So in California, the biggest county is in San Luis Obispo, because they seasonally or periodically will harvest or raise wheat or barley on those foothills, and that you know, qualifies them for the program. So California is never, and then of course you mentioned the rental rates are way low for compared to just you know, just doesn't even make taxes for most places in California. So I don't ever expect to see CRP unless they change the rule. I don't expect it's going to ever be a big player here in California. CSP, on the other hand, the Conservation Security Program, is very much underutilized. And as mentioned, the state conservationist Carlos Suarez would really like to see more emphasis placed on that. And that means that if you're doing good things already for conservation, then you get rewarded with the Conservation Security Program, the Conservation Stewardship Program. Where it is a little bit tougher for equip, because just nest boxes probably is not going to qualify you high enough. You have to have other things going on your soil, water, air, plants, animals on your farm or ranch in order to be highly ranked for that equip program. I think there's about 6 applications for every project that's awarded in California, so it's very highly competitive.
Thank
think
you,
we're-
Wendell. Oh,
Yeah, thank you so much, Wendell. We are just about out of time, but we have a post survey that if you are still on the call, we would love you to fill in before we wrap up. And the next session is when, Joanne?
It is in 2 weeks on a Wednesday. And Shelley, do you have that date? I wanted to, while you're looking that up, I just wanted to say that Wendell will be speaking at one of the talks later on. So we get to hear more from him, and he is also on our board. We are so lucky to have both Sara and Wendell on with some other stellar people helping guide our work.
Put out on March 30th, lesson 2.
Yep.
And then you can follow the link that he just added in the chat to the rest of the courses.
Great. Right. Thank you so much for filling out this survey. This helps us both do our work better and helps us report back to our funder that they are spending their money well.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much.